Blood freezes differently than water. It crystallizes into patterns that speak of destiny, forming runes upon stone that only the dead can read. In the winter of our 9th year under Jarl Gunnar's banner, we learned that some victories carve themselves so deep into the earth that the soil itself weeps for generations. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants. Our longships sat motionless in the grey water, their dragon heads turned toward a shore that held secrets older than memory. 43 warriors breathed in unison, their exhalations creating small clouds that rose and vanished like prayers offered to an indifferent sky. Each man carried within his chest the weight of iron and oath, the cold certainty that this dawn would demand payment in flesh and spirit. Gunnar stood at the prow of the lead vessel, his weathered hands gripping the carved serpent's neck. His eyes held the color of winter storms, grey-blue depths that had witnessed the birth and death of countless seasons. The runes tattooed across his forearms seemed to shift in the pale light, ancient symbols that pulsed with the rhythm of his heart. He had not spoken since the ritual of departure 3 days prior, when the cedar woman cast the bones and pronounced our fate written in blood upon distant stone. The silence stretched between us like a taut bar-string. In this quiet, we found our strength. Words were for merchants and thralls. Warriors spoke in the language of steel and sacrifice. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against hull, the creak of rope and timber, and the soft whisper of wind through the rigging. These were the voices of the elements, the conversation between ship and sea that had guided our people across the whale road for countless generations. Each warrior performed his own ritual of preparation. Some traced protective runes upon their weapon hilts, fingers moving in patterns learned at their father's knees. Others sat in meditation, their breathing slow and measured, drawing strength from the core of their being. A few closed their eyes and spoke silently to their ancestors, seeking guidance from those who had walked this path before. The youngest among us, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, trembled not with fear but with anticipation, knowing that this day would forge his spirit in ways that no amount of training could achieve. The target lay ahead, shrouded in morning fog, a Christian monastery perched upon a rocky outcropping like a wounded bird clinging to its nest. The monks within had grown wealthy from the offerings of pilgrims, their stone walls protecting treasures that gleamed with stolen sunlight. Gold and silver accumulated behind those sacred walls while our own children shivered through harsh winters, while our elders bent their backs to coax grain from frozen earth. The Christ God's servants spoke of peace, while hoarding the abundance that rightfully belonged to those with the courage to claim it. But this was not mere raiding. The Sidra woman's prophecy had spoken of transformation, of a deed that would echo through the ages like thunder rolling across mountain peaks. She had seen visions in the smoke of burning herbs, images of blood and fire that would reshape the very fabric of fate. Her words had been cryptic, wrapped in the language of the other world. When iron tastes sacred blood, the serpent of time will devour its own tail. We understood that this day would demand more than simple plunder. It would require sacrifice of a kind that would mark us forever. The monastery bells began to ring, their bronze voices calling the faithful to morning prayers. The sound drifted across the water like the cries of seabirds, haunting and beautiful in the crisp air. Soon those same bells would ring in alarm, their peaceful song transformed into desperate warning. The Christ followers would learn that their God's protection extended only as far as mortal men could reach, with sword and shield. Our oars bit into the dark water with synchronized precision, propelling us toward destiny. Each stroke brought us closer to the moment when silence would shatter into violence, when the carefully maintained peace of morning would explode into chaos and bloodshed. The monastery grew larger with each passing heartbeat, its stone walls becoming more distinct, its wooden gates revealing the weakness that would soon be exploited by Nordic steel. In the growing light, we could see figures moving within the compound, monks going about their morning rituals, tending gardens, carrying water, preparing bread for the day ahead. They moved with the unhurried pace of men who believed themselves safe, protected by their God's love, and the isolation of their rocky sanctuary. They had no knowledge of the storm approaching across the water, no understanding that their peaceful world was about to be transformed by fire and iron. The wind shifted, carrying to us the scent of incense and baking bread, the comfortable smells of settled life. But underneath these familiar odors lay something else. something that made the hair on our necks rise and our hands tighten on weapon grips. It was the smell of fate itself, metallic and sharp, the scent that clings to moments when the threads of destiny are about to be cut and rewoven in patterns too terrible and beautiful for mortal eyes to comprehend. The first cry pierced the morning silence like a blade through flesh. Brother Marcus, tending his herb garden in the early light, looked up to see dragon-proud ships emerging from the mist like creatures born from nightmare. His scream died in his throat as understanding flooded through him. Not the understanding of imminent death, but the deeper recognition that this moment had been written in the stars long before his birth. Our feet found purchase on wet stone as we vaulted from longship to shore. The sound of iron-shod boots against rock created a rhythm older than civilization, the drumbeat of warriors claiming new ground. Gunnar raised his battle-axe toward the lightening sky, and in that gesture we saw not aggression but reverence. This was ritual as much as raid ceremony wrapped in violence, worship expressed through the ancient language of sword and spear. The monastery gates stood open, an invitation that spoke of either divine confidence or mortal foolishness. Beyond the threshold lay a courtyard where morning shadows still clung to stone walls, where the last moments of peace settled like dust upon surfaces that would soon be painted crimson. Brother Marcus dropped his basket of herbs and fled toward the bell tower, his sandaled feet slapping against flagstones in desperate rhythm. We flowed through the gates like water finding its level, each warrior moving with practiced efficiency toward predetermined targets. There was no chaos in our advance, no wild berserker fury, only the cold precision of men who had transformed killing into sacrament. The youngest monks scattered like startled deer, their brown robes fluttering behind them, as they sought sanctuary in chambers that would offer no protection from Nordic steel. The first blood spilled belonged to Brother Aldrich, the keeper of manuscripts. He stood his ground in the scriptorium, ancient parchments clutched to his chest, like shields that might deflect the blow of Thorstein's siegs. The blade found its mark between ribs, sliding home with the soft whisper of metal parting flesh. Aldrich's eyes widened, not with pain but with wonder, as if in that final moment he glimpsed something beyond the veil of mortality that his years of prayer had never revealed. The illuminated Gospels fell from his dying hands, their gold leaf catching the morning light as they scattered across stone floors already darkening with spreading pools. Each manuscript represented years of patient labor, countless hours spent in quiet devotion, transforming words into art and art into prayer. Now they lay trampled beneath the boots of men who could not read their Latin verses, but understood perfectly the language of conquest and submission. Brother Jerome emerged from the chapel carrying a silver cross, his aged hands steady despite the chaos erupting around him. He spoke no words of curse or condemnation, offered no prayers for deliverance. Instead, he held the sacred symbol before him like a talisman, his weathered face serene with the acceptance that comes only to those who have spent lifetimes preparing for eternity. Hilmar's spear took him through the heart, the iron point emerging from his back to pin him against the wooden door of his sanctuary. The bells continued their frantic ringing, their bronze voices now discordant with panic. Brother Marcus had reached the tower and pulled the alarm rope with desperate strength, sending the warning cry across the countryside. But the sound carried more than mere alarm. It carried the death song of an age, the funeral dirge for a way of life that was ending in blood and fire. In the treasury chamber, we found wealth that defied imagination. Gold chalices caught the flickering light of oil lamps, their surfaces engraved with symbols of suffering and redemption. Silver plates bore images of saints whose martyrdom had prepared them for precisely this moment of transformation. Jeweled reliquaries held fragments of bone and cloth, sacred remnants of the dead pressed into service of the living. Each piece represented not mere treasure, but the accumulated faith of generations, the physical manifestation of countless prayers and offerings. Yet as our hands closed around these prizes, we felt no triumph, no satisfaction of conquest achieved. The weight of gold seemed insufficient compared to the weight of what we had set in motion. The seedy woman's prophecy echoed in our minds like the monastery bells, her words taking on new meaning with each life that fled beneath our blades. This was transformation indeed, but not of the kind we had anticipated. Brother Cuthbert, the eldest among the monks, waited for us in the heart of the chapel. He knelt before the altar, his white hair catching the colored light that streamed through stained glass windows. His lips moved in silent prayer, not for salvation, but for understanding, seeking in his final moments some comprehension of the divine plan that had brought Nordic warriors to his sacred threshold. When Gunnar's axe fell, it separated more than flesh from spirit. It severed one age from another, cutting the thread that bound past to future. The silence that followed was deeper than any we had known. Even the bells had ceased their ringing. Brother Marcus, having fallen beneath Olaf's sword, somewhere in the tower's winding stairs, blood pooled on consecrated ground, creating patterns that seemed to mirror the runes carved into our weapon hilts. The morning light, filtering through gore-stained windows, painted everything in shades of amber and crimson, transforming the chapel into a chamber where sacred and profane had become indistinguishable. We gathered the treasures with hands that trembled not from fear, but from recognition. Each piece of gold and silver carried within it the weight of transformation, the knowledge that we had become something other than what we were when the sun first rose. The monastery's wealth would fill our longships, but the true treasure we carried away was invisible, intangible, the understanding that some acts of violence transcend mere conquest and become rituals of cosmic significance. As we prepared to depart, Gunnar stood alone in the bloodied chapel, his axe hanging loose in his hand. His eyes, still storm grey but somehow changed, gazed upon the carnage with an expression that mingled satisfaction with something deeper, more troubling. He had led us in battle countless times, had overseen raids that filled our halls with plunder and our songs with glory. But this was different. This was the moment when warrior became something else, when the boundaries between human and myth began to dissolve in pools of sacred blood. The return journey carried us across waters that seemed darker than before, as if the sea itself had absorbed the weight of what we had accomplished. Our longships rode low with treasure, gold and silver distributed among warriors who sat in silence deeper than the depths beneath our keels. The morning's violence had transformed us into something beyond mere raiders. We had become bearers of a secret too profound for words, carriers of knowledge that burned in our chests like swallowed fire. Gunnar stood at the steering oar, his face carved from granite, eyes fixed on horizons that seemed to recede even as we approached them. The runes on his forearms had darkened, the tattoos appearing to pulse with life independent of the flesh that bore them. He had not spoken since the chapel, since the moment when his axe completed its sacred arc, and Brother Cuthbert's prayer ended in a spray of crimson across holy ground. Speech had become inadequate, insufficient to contain the magnitude of what we had set in motion. The youngest among us, Bjorn Ironside's son, sat hunched over his first bloodied blade. The weapon trembled in his grip, not from weakness, but from the power it now contained, the spiritual weight of transformation that accompanies every warrior's initial killing. His eyes held the hollow look of one who has gazed into the abyss and found it gazing back, who has learned that courage and horror are often indistinguishable in the moment of their expression. Behind us, smoke rose from the monastery like a black prayer ascending to an indifferent sky. The buildings burned with flames that seemed to reach toward heaven itself, as if the very stones cried out for judgment upon what they had witnessed. The fire would consume more than timber and thatch. It would devour the last vestiges of an age when Christian and Norseman could exist in the same world without cosmic consequence. The treasure ships followed our wake like mourners in a funeral procession, their dragon heads bowed beneath the weight of plundered sanctity. Each piece of gold and silver carried within it the echo of prayers interrupted, of devotions cut short by Nordic steel. The chalices that had held Christ's blood now held only shadows, their sacred purpose transformed into symbols of conquest that would never again know the touch of consecrated wine. Thorstein removed his helmet and let the wind carry through his hair, grey strands that spoke of battles fought and survived. His scarred hands traced patterns in the air, runes of protection and binding that seemed inadequate against the forces we had unleashed. He understood, as we all did, that some victories exact prices that extend far beyond the battlefield, that some treasures carry curses woven into their very substance. The seabirds that followed our ships cried with voices that seemed to mock our silence. Their harsh calls echoed across the water like the laughter of gods who had witnessed countless such moments, who understood that mortal men inevitably mistake transformation for triumph, who know that every ending carries within it the seeds of consequences too vast for human comprehension. In the hold of the lead ship, the monastery's most precious relic lay wrapped in blood-stained cloth, a fragment of the true cross, or so the monks had believed. The wood felt ordinary beneath calloused fingers, no different from the oak of our ship's planking or the ash of our weapon shafts. Yet something about it seemed to pulse with life, as if the sacrifice it supposedly represented had awakened in response to the sacrifice we had offered in return. The wind died as afternoon approached, leaving us becalmed on waters smooth as polished bronze. Our oars bit into the stillness with mechanical precision, each stroke a heartbeat in the chest of a world holding its breath. The silence aboard our ships had become infectious, spreading from warrior to warrior, like a contagion of comprehension too terrible for vocalization. Eric the Wise, eldest among our number, sat sharpening his seeks with movements that seemed ritualistic rather than practical. The blade already held an edge that could split hairs, but his hands continued their work, as if the repetitive motion might somehow grind away the weight of what we carried. His eyes, clouded with age and wisdom, gazed not at the blade but through it, seeing patterns in the steel that spoke of fates intertwined beyond mortal understanding. The captured treasures seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, as if the gold absorbed moisture from the sea air and transformed it into accusation. The silver reliquaries that had once held fragments of saints now held only emptiness, their sacred contents scattered across monastery stones that would never again know the tread of sandaled feet. Each piece of plunder carried within it the weight of interrupted prayers, of lives cut short in service to transformation neither Christian nor Norse could fully comprehend. As the sun reached its zenith, casting our shadows directly beneath us like dark anchors dragging at our souls, Gunnar finally spoke. His voice carried across the water with the authority of one who had looked upon cosmic significance and found it wanting. "The Sedai woman's prophecy," he said, each word falling into the silence like stones dropped into deep water. "When iron tastes sacred blood, the serpent of time devours its own tail." We understood then that we had become the serpent, and the monastery had been our own tail. The realization settled over us like a shroud woven from understanding, too profound for comfort. We had thought ourselves agents of conquest, warriors claiming treasure from those too weak to defend it. Instead, we had become instruments of fate, participants in a cosmic ritual that would echo through ages yet unborn. The massacre had changed everything, not because of what we had destroyed, but because of what we had become in the destroying. The treasures in our holds would buy no lasting satisfaction, would purchase no peace for spirits that had been transformed by violence into carriers of burden too heavy for mortal shoulders. We were returning home as different men than those who had departed, bearing not merely gold and silver, but the knowledge that some victories are indistinguishable from defeat, that some transformations are irreversible as death itself. The familiar shoreline appeared through evening mist, like a memory half remembered, its rocky contours softened by distance and the weight of what we carried. Our village waited beyond the beach, cooking fires sending thin columns of smoke into the darkening sky, but the sight brought no comfort to hearts heavy with transformation. We had departed as raiders and returned as something else entirely, bearers of a burden that would reshape not only our own lives, but the very fabric of the world we thought we knew. Our keels scraped against the shingle with a sound like bones grinding against stone. Warriors who had leaped eagerly from these same ships mere days before now climbed over the sides with movements that spoke of reluctance, of men who understood that each step toward home carried them further from who they had been. The treasure chests, so eagerly gathered from monastery floors, now seemed to drag at our strength like anchors forged from guilt and consequence. The women and children gathered at the water's edge, their faces bright with anticipation of stories and plunder, their voices raised in songs of welcome that died on their lips when they saw our expressions. Gunnar's wife, Astrid, stepped forward with outstretched arms, but stopped when she glimpsed the change in her husband's storm-grey eyes. The runes on his forearms seemed to writhe in the firelight, and she understood without words that the man who had returned was not entirely the one who had departed. Young Bjorn collapsed to his knees in the surf, his bloodied sword falling from nerveless fingers to disappear beneath the dark water. His mother reached for him, but he shrank from her touch, as if kindness itself had become a form of torment. The boy who had dreamed of glory and gold now carried within his chest the weight of transformation that no amount of maternal comfort could ease. He had learned that some prices can only be paid in solitude, some burdens carried only by those who have earned the right through violence and loss. The treasure was unloaded in silence. each piece of gold and silver passing from ship to shore like relics of a civilization that no longer existed. The chalices caught the firelight and threw it back in patterns that seemed accusatory, their sacred surfaces reflecting flames that looked too much like the fire that had consumed the monastery. Children reached for the gleaming objects with eager hands, but their parents pulled them back, sensing something unwholesome in the beauty of plundered sanctity. Gunnar stood apart from the celebration that never quite began, his axe still hanging from his belt, like a weight that could never be set aside. The weapon had tasted sacred blood and been transformed by the experience, its steel now bearing an edge that cut through more than flesh and bone. It had become a tool of cosmic significance, an instrument of fate that would demand further service before its hunger could be satisfied. The village Sidrov woman emerged from her hut on the hill, her ancient face creased with lines that spoke of visions both terrible and true. She approached Gunnar with steps that seemed to measure the distance between present and future, her eyes holding depths that reflected knowledge of consequences yet to unfold. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of one who had walked between worlds and returned with truths too profound for comfort. "You have fed the serpent," she said, her words falling into the silence like prophecy made manifest. "Now you must watch it grow until it devours all that you hold dear." Gunnar nodded, understanding at last the full weight of what the morning's violence had set in motion. The massacre had not been conquest but sacrifice, not victory but the first payment in a debt that would span generations. The celebration feast began without joy, warriors and their families gathering around fires that seemed to burn with insufficient warmth. The monastery's wine was poured into Norse drinking horns, Christ's blood transformed into mead that tasted of copper and regret. Each cup raised in apparent victory carried within it the knowledge that some triumphs are indistinguishable from defeat, some prizes too costly for the souls that claim them. Stories were told, but not of glory. Instead, the warriors spoke in hushed tones of silence and transformation, of moments when violence transcended mere conquest and became ritual of cosmic significance. They described the weight of sacred blood on their blades, the way the monastery bells had changed their song from worship to warning, the expressions on monks' faces as they realized that their prayers had been answered in ways they never anticipated. The younger men listened with expressions that mixed fascination and horror, understanding that they had witnessed the birth of legend, but recognizing also that legends are often born from tragedies too profound for simple celebration. The massacre would be remembered, would be sung by skalds and carved into stone, but the songs would carry within them echoes of sorrow that no amount of gold could silence. As the night deepened, warriors began to drift away from the fires, seeking solitude in which to contemplate the weight of transformation. Some walked the shoreline where waves whispered secrets to the stones. Others climbed the hills where ancient cairns marked the graves of ancestors who had carried similar burdens. All carried within their chests the knowledge that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Gunnar remained by the dying fire long after the others had departed, his hands wrapped around a silver chalice that seemed to pulse with life independent of the metal from which it was forged. His wife sat beside him in silence, understanding that some burdens must be carried alone, some transformations witnessed but not shared. The treasure surrounded them like accusation made manifest, beautiful and terrible in its gleaming abundance. The wind carried to them the scent of smoke from distant fires, the smell of wood and thatch and something else, the metallic tang of blood that had soaked into monastery stones and would never wash clean. They understood that the massacre had changed everything, not through the treasure it had gained, but through the spiritual weight it had imposed upon souls unprepared for such profound transformation. When dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with colors that reminded them too much of monastery flames, Gunnar finally spoke. His words fell into the silence like stones dropped into deep water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the moment of their utterance. "The serpent has tasted its own tail," he said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "Now we must watch it complete the circle, no matter what the cost." 3 winters passed before the full weight of the Sidrov woman's prophecy revealed itself. 3 cycles of snow and thaw during which the monastery's treasure brought no lasting peace for souls, transformed by violence into instruments of fate. The gold purchased grain during harsh seasons. The silver bought weapons for young warriors eager to prove themselves worthy of saga and song. But the weight of what had been sacrificed in that sacred place continued to grow, like a serpent feeding on its own flesh, until nothing remained but hunger. Gunnar aged decades in those 3 years, his storm-grey hair turning white as winter frost, his once powerful frame bending beneath burdens visible only to those who had shared in the monastery's transformation. The runes on his forearms had faded, their dark lines becoming scars that ached with each change of weather, each shift in the cosmic balance that his actions had disturbed. He spoke less with each passing season, his words becoming precious as silver, weighty as gold. The village prospered in ways that brought no joy. Young men came from distant settlements, drawn by stories of treasure and glory, seeking to join a warband that had achieved a legendary status through a single morning's work. But those who had been present at the monastery recognized in these eager faces their own former innocence, the spiritual blindness that allowed warriors to mistake violence for victory, conquest for transformation. Astrid watched her husband diminish like a candle burning at both ends, his substance consumed by fires that no amount of water could extinguish. She understood that the man she had married had died in that distant chapel, replaced by someone who bore his face, but carried within his chest the weight of cosmic consequence. The treasure that surrounded them felt more like grave goods than plunder, beautiful objects marking the death of the world they had known. The youngest warrior from that distant raid, Bjorn Ironside's son, had never spoken again after returning from the monastery. He tended his weapons with obsessive care, sharpening blades that already held edges keen enough to split shadows, oiling mail that showed no trace of rust. His silence had become profound as the depths of the Rewrote, containing within it depths that even the wisest could not fathom. His mother brought him food that went largely untouched, understanding that some hungers cannot be satisfied by bread and meat. On the anniversary of the massacre, strange signs began to appear throughout the settlement. Livestock born with deformities that suggested runic patterns, crops that grew in spirals reminiscent of serpents consuming their own tails, wells that ran red with water that tasted of iron and regret. The Sidra woman spent her days casting bones and reading omens, her aged face growing more troubled with each divination. The cosmic balance had been disturbed, and the weight of that disturbance was beginning to manifest in ways that touched all who lived beneath the northern sky. Ships began arriving from distant lands, their crews speaking of similar signs, similar disturbances. Christian monks reported visions of burning monasteries. Pagan seers described dreams of serpents devouring the world tree. The massacre had not been an isolated act of violence, but the first movement in a symphony of transformation that would encompass all who dwelt between earth and sky. The serpent of time had indeed begun to devour its own tail, and the process could not be stopped, only witnessed and endured. Gunnar summoned his warriors on the night when the northern lights danced with unusual intensity, their green and gold ribbons writing messages in the sky that only the dead could read. The men gathered around a fire built from monastery timbers, pieces of sacred wood that burned with flames the color of spilled blood. Each warrior carried within his chest the weight of shared transformation, the knowledge that they had become instruments of fate too vast for mortal comprehension. The prophecy nears completion, Gunnar spoke, his voice carrying across the circle like wind through standing stones. We fed the serpent's sacred blood, and now it grows strong enough to swallow worlds. The warriors nodded, understanding at last that their raid had not been conquest but sacrifice, not victory, but the first payment in a debt that would consume everything they held dear. The treasure was gathered and loaded onto ships once more, but this time the destination was not distant shores but the depths of the Rewrote itself. Each piece of gold and silver would be offered to the sea, returned to the cosmic balance from which it had been stolen through violence and transformation. The chalices would hold water instead of wine. The reliquaries would contain salt instead of saints' bones. The monastery's wealth would feed the serpent one final time before the circle closed and the cosmic balance was restored. As they sailed toward the deep waters where the kraken slept and the world serpent waited, Gunnar felt the weight of transformation lifting from his shoulders like fog dispersing before the morning sun. The treasure would buy absolution not through its value, but through its sacrifice. its return to the cosmic forces from which it had been taken. The monastery's gold would purchase peace for souls that had been marked by violence. Its silver would buy silence for spirits that had learned the true cost of transformation. The chest sank beneath the dark waters with sounds like bells tolling, their weight carrying to the seafloor the accumulated prayers of generations, the crystallized faith of those who had served a god of peace and found themselves transformed by Nordic steel. Each piece of treasure that disappeared beneath the waves took with it a portion of the burden that had marked them since that distant morning when monastery bells rang, in alarm and sacred blood, blessed unholy ground. When the last chalice vanished beneath the waves, Gunnar felt his youth return like springtime after the longest winter. The runes on his forearms began to fade, their dark lines dissolving into unmarked flesh as the cosmic balance shifted toward equilibrium. The serpent of time had completed its circuit, devouring its own tail until nothing remained but the eternal cycle of transformation that governs all things beneath the wheeling stars. The return journey carried them across waters that seemed cleaner than before, as if the sea itself had been purified by their sacrifice. The familiar shoreline appeared through morning mist, like a promise of redemption, its rocky contours softened by the knowledge that some burdens can be lifted, some transformations reversed through willing sacrifice. They had learned that the greatest victories are often indistinguishable from defeat, that the most profound conquests are achieved through surrender rather than violence. The village waited beyond the beach, but the men who returned were different from those who had departed for the second time. They carried within their chests not the weight of cosmic consequence, but the peace that comes to those who have fed the serpent of time and watched it complete its eternal circuit. The massacre had changed everything, but the sacrifice had changed it back, restoring the balance between sacred and profane, between Christian and Norse, between transformation and redemption. In the end, they understood that the forgotten massacre would be remembered not for the treasure it had gained, but for the wisdom it had cost, not for the lives it had claimed, but for the souls it had ultimately saved through the weight of consequence willingly borne, and finally released into the depths where all transformations find their rest.